Welcome to this latest edition of Armchair Explorations for Zegram Expeditions. My name is Dr. Terence Christian. I am one of Zegram's archaeologists and historians. Today we're going to talk about a little-known family that left a monumental and unsurpassed legacy in marine engineering, the Lighthouse Stevensons. The image that you see in front of you is the headquarters of the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh, Scotland, and it's around this building that our story is going to pivot. So hold this image in your mind. We'll come back to it at the very end of the talk, but keep it there because this is going to be the focus of both the Stevensons' dynastic activities and also the terminus for our exploration. Without further ado, let's go back into deep antiquity and see where lighthouses in the United Kingdom, and dare I say it, from much of the modern world, actually take their start. The earliest known lighthouse in the United Kingdom, discounting the ephemeral beacons that you find around the coast, is the Roman Pharos at Dover Castle, which you can see the little arrow pointing to it on the promontory there. Now, the point on which this castle sits is the shortest crossing between England and France, and therefore in antiquity this was a major shipping route between the continent and the archipelago that is the United Kingdom and Ireland. In the early 2nd century AD, the Roman military constructs the Pharos, or lighthouse, above this harbor to guide ships around the strategic point and into the Dower estuary below. Now, not only is the Roman Pharos at Dover Castle the most complete and the tallest Roman structure standing in Britain today, it's also only one of 3 Roman lighthouses to survive to present. The other 2 are in Leptis Magna in Libya and Corunna in Spain. During its operational life, it would have had a sister light opposite the harbor on the Western Heights, but unfortunately, this light no longer exists in the present. The 8-sided light stands on the tallest part of Castle Hill and inside the outer curtain wall of the later medieval structures. The tower stands roughly 15.8 meters high and about 12.2 meters wide at the base, to give you a sense of scale, but it has been patched numerous times in its nearly 2,000-year history. Internally, the tower is pretty standard. It has 5 floors supported by socketed putlogs and timber floors, with 3 to 4 vaulted antechambers per floor set into each wall. Each of these antechambers probably terminated in a vaulted window, which were blocked up sometime during the earlier High Medieval period. Unlike its current appearance, it's highly likely the Roman Pharos would have had a stepped or conical appearance, a design passed to us from contemporary Roman depictions like this Romano-British floor tile you see on the left part of your screen. This was discovered in 1856 and it's now in the British Museum, so when you're next in London, if you want to see one of the only surviving examples we have of a Roman lighthouse, by all means head down there. It's an amazing artifact to look at. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the conical stepped structure, this cake-like structure of the Roman Pharos, as well as those blocked-up antechamber windows, those dark spots on the wall. The top section we'll talk about in a second. That's a later addition. So this is what we have of the Roman Pharos, and of course there's the medieval castle behind it. The Roman section only survives to a height of about 12.5 meters, with the additional 3.3 meters being early High or Late Medieval additions added to repurpose the tower as a belfry for the Associated Anglo-Saxon Church of St. Mary in Castro, which dates to about 1000 AD. The last modification of the belfry was in 1426 to 1436 by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and it was subsequently roofed in 1582 for use as a gunpowder store, which is a pretty common reuse of antiquated buildings. The Parthenon, of course, is famously reused by the Turks as a gunpowder store before it explodes, and we're left with the ruins that we see today. By the first quarter of the 18th century, the tower had been stripped of its roof and then left to, quote, struggle with the sea, air, and weather, so says William Stuckley in 1722, as it had done for the previous 1500 years when it was a harbor light. Of interest to us is the lack of a connecting passage or bridge, which would have allowed entry to the tower from the second-story church door to the converted Roman window that we talked about previously. And you can see that door, that hanging door, on the right-hand side of the church wall. Additionally, the crenellations are noted in Samuel and Nathaniel Buck's 1732 engraving, but they're not shown to us in William Stuckley's 1722 engraving. So they may have been added in the early 18th century or possibly a later addition by George Gilbert Scott's 1860s restoration. Scott is, of course, a noted neo-Gothic romantic architect who likes to throw crenellations on everything he can get his hands on, including my alma mater, University of Glasgow, where he did the university building, which looks like it walked out of some medieval fantasy. So the tower has had a very long life to it, but its core, this idea of a coastal beacon, really goes back to Britain's origins, and this struggle with the coast and weather and navigation is something that will carry us from the antiquated past into the modern engineering struggles of the present, of the Scottish engineering revolution. Our story of the lighthouse Stevensons begins both in the early medieval period as well as contemporary with the engineering dynasty's founder. Poet Robert Southey pens the Inchcape Rock between 1796 and 1798, with publication in the Morning Post in 1802. The painting in front of you gives you a rough idea of what the Inchcape Rock looks like in a relatively contemporary painting with the poem. The poem tells the legend of how the hazardous Inchcape Rock becomes the Bell Rock due to the actions of the 14th century abbot of Arbroath and the pirate Sir Ralph the Rover. Probably one of the best pirate names, if you ask me. It's on the Bell Rock, though, that the engineering Stevensons would establish their reputation as unsurpassed lighthouse engineers. This early work, penned some 10-plus years before the Stevensons began their monumental empire of lights, sets the stage both for an entwined engineering and literary obsession the likes of which we haven't seen since. And we'll explore this literary entwinement a few times over the course of this talk. But for now, we'll start setting that scene with The Inchcape Rock by Robert Southey. No stir in the air, no stir in the sea, the ship was as still as she could be. Her sails from heaven received no motion, her keel was steady in the ocean. Without either sign or sound of their shock, the waves flowed over the Inchcape Rock. So little they rose, so little they fell, they did not move the Inchcape Bell. The abbot of Arbroath had placed the bell on the Inchcape Rock. On a buoy in the storm it floated and swung, and over the waves its warning rung. When the rock was hid by the surge's swell, the mariners heard the warning bell, and then they knew the perilous rock, and blessed the abbot of Arbroath. The sun in heaven was shining gay, all things were joyful on that day. The seabirds screamed as they wheeled round, and there was joyance in their sound. The buoy of the Inchcape Bell was seen, a darker speck on the ocean green. So Ralph the Rover walked his deck, and he fixed his eye on the darker speck. He felt the cheering power of spring, it made him whistle, it made him sing. His heart was mirthful to excess, but the rover's mirth was wickedness. His eye was on the Inchcape float, quoth he, my men put out the boat, and row me to the Inchcape Rock, and I'll plague the abbot of Arbroath. The boat is lowered, the boatmen row, and to the Inchcape Rock they go. Sir Ralph bent over from the boat, and he cut the bell from the Inchcape float. Down sunk the bell with a gurgling sound, the bubbles rose and burst around. Quoth Sir Ralph, the next who comes to the rock won't bless the abbot of Arbroath. Sir Ralph the Rover sailed away, he scoured the seas for many a day, and now grown rich with plunder store, he steers his course for Scotland's shore. So thick a haze o'erspreads the sky, they cannot see the sun on high. The wind hath blown a gale all day, at evening it hath died away. On the deck the Rover takes his stand, so dark it is they see no land. Quoth Sir Ralph, it'll be lighter soon, for there is the dawn of the rising moon. Canst hear, said one, the breakers roar? For methinks we should be near the shore. Now where are we cannot tell, but I wish I could hear the Inchcape Bell. They hear no sound, the swell is strong, though the wind hath fallen, they drift along, till the vessel strikes a shivering shock. O Christ, it is the Inchcape Rock. Sir Ralph the Rover tore his hair, he cursed himself in his despair. The waves rush in on every side, the ship is sinking beneath the tide. But even in his dying fear, one dreadful sound could the Rover hear, a sound as if, with the Inchcape Bell, the devil below was ringing his knell. So the Inchcape Rock, through piracy, wrecking, accident, it becomes the Bell Rock, and this entwined nature of name and origin is similarly entwined with the history of UK lighthouses and the greatest family of lighthouse engineers the world has ever seen, that of the Lighthouse Stevensons. So we can see that there's a long entwined history of coastal beacons of lighthouses within the United Kingdom, and there's an obsession between weather, coast, navigation, and shipping that we'd expect from an island seafaring nation. But where does the actual start of the Stevenson dynasty begin? Well, it starts with this man, Robert Stevenson. He's born 8th of June 1772 in Glasgow, in what is a veritably unmapped country, both interior and at sea. Scotland consists of close to 800 islands and has a coastline roughly 11,000 miles long. For those of you working in metric, that's roughly 17,700 kilometers in length. But it's really the events of his young childhood which would shape the family's destiny as lighthouse engineers. In the 1780s, especially 1782, there's a series of violent storms which cause a huge loss of life and a huge loss of money. About 20% of all shipping commerce is lost due to accidents in navigation and wrecking on rocks, so it's a rather major economic loss that needs to be addressed. And the government responds to this loss of commerce by passing the Erection of Lighthouses Act of 1786, which establishes the commissioners of the Northern Lighthouses, which become the Northern Lighthouse Board, or NLB, that we saw the headquarters of on that cover slide. as well as establishing 4 lighthouses at Kinnaird Head, at North Ronaldsay, at Scalpay, and at the Mull of Kintyre. Now, if you're really interested in the Act, you can see it on the Houses of Parliament website and read it in its entirety. It is as scintillating as it sounds. But what's critical to it is that they established these 4 lighthouses, which, to quote the Act, would be conducive to the safety of mariners around the coast of Scotland. Don't think, though, that lighthouses are universally popular. That 20% loss of commerce is 20% loss of commerce for the shipping companies. The remoteness and weather of lighthouse sites often creates shipwrecks, hence the Act. But the business of wrecking, of scavenging, and sometimes even causing wrecks for profit by locals means that many of these lighthouse construction projects were met with distrust at best and usually with outright hostility. So, however, while all is well and good to fund the more modern lighthouses, you have a hostile population and you have a pretty unmapped idea of how to go about doing this. So how do you design and build something that's never really been built before? Scotland at this point only has 1 major lighthouse on the Isle of May, as well as a few smaller lights in the Firths of Tay and Clyde, which are quite literally coal braziers, kind of like big bonfires on the coast. None of the major shipping lanes, including the most hazardous of passages, are marked at this point. So who do you appoint? Well, it's not Robert Stevenson, despite what I told you at the start. You actually appoint a self-made Edinburgh tinsmith for the contract. His name is Thomas Smith, and he has absolutely no background in marine engineering whatsoever. But he uses his existing knowledge building street lights for Edinburgh's government to design a mirror collector reflector centered on an oil wick lamp. And as a visual for you, the design looks something like a concave bowl disco ball with a large Roman oil lamp made out of brass shoved in the center. It's pretty basic. But the commissioners of Northern Lighthouses see this as the future, and it's installing the first Smith reflector at Kinnaird Head, Kinnaird Castle, in Fraserburgh, which is the jumping-off point of the Baltic trade, that starts this energetic building of lighthouses that Robert Stevenson will take forward. Now, Smith completes all 4 of the original lighthouses, the NLB, just for ease of explanation, lighthouses, and it sets the stage for Robert Stevenson to create this lasting Stevenson dynasty. So where does Stevenson get in with this? Well, Robert Stevenson is Thomas Smith's stepson and apprentice, and he becomes Smith's stepson as part of Smith's 3rd marriage. Stevenson, as Smith's apprentice, is then entrusted by his stepfather with installing his stepfather/apprentice master's lamp at the Clock Lighthouse on the Lower Clyde in 1797. Thomas Smith, with Robert Stevenson as his assistant for many of these lights, would complete 13 lighthouses in his life, which is an approximate number that would follow many of the Stevensons in their career. In addition, Smith does one other thing that Robert Stevenson will take forward, and he starts the Lighthouse Keepers Regulations. Now, this regulation is followed, as I say, with Robert Stevenson, but it's followed throughout his generations up to the present. It still exists as a guiding principle for lighthouse keepers, both within the United Kingdom as well as the rest of the world, which we'll see very late in the talk. The regulations follow naval regulations and were quite harsh. When on watch, keepers could do nothing but keep watch, maintain the lamp, and take weather readings. Everything else, all other activities, including reading, are forbidden and grounds for immediate dismissal. Now, as an aside, in the weirdness that is the past, Robert Stevenson took a shine to Thomas Smith's daughter, and he would actually go on to marry her. So by 1800, Stevenson is Smith's stepson, his son-in-law, and his business partner, and this is why he sets the stage for the dynasty. In 1799, another round of storms battered the Scottish coast. The most fatal of these hazards is the Bell Rock. As I say, the major navigation paths are not marked at this point. The Bell Rock is a tidally submerged reef located about 11 miles off the coast of Angus near Arbroath, that abbot of Arbroath we heard about previously. And you can see the final edifice that we'll talk about in front of you here, as well as part of the exposed tidal reef. But here at the Bell Rock is where Robert's going to make his name, and he's going to start that dynasty. He wanted to build the light on the rock. However, Parliament saw Robert as the junior to Thomas Smith's intellect and adventure, and so they wouldn't fund his own independent project. Robert, though, is an ambitious individual, and he wouldn't let this slight go unnoticed. So he recognizes that his own unknown reputation as a lighthouse engineer needs some sort of professional backing, some clout. So he enlists the assistance and reputation of John Rennie the Elder, the famed Scottish engineer, as his partner in this project. It's an astute maneuver because Robert gets his Act of Parliament passed, but Rennie would supervise from afar, visiting the site once a year, while Stevenson would be the day-to-day management. In 1807, Stevenson established a shore station in Arbroath Harbour from which he could ship dressed stone to the Bell Rock. Stevenson wouldn't compromise on the structural integrity of the lighthouse, so to prepare the site, he dispatched a team of 60 men with picks to level the reef by hand. He even brought a blacksmith along to actually sharpen the picks on site in a bit of forethought. People wonder why he didn't do black powder blasting, as this would have been faster, but Stephen feared that damaging the bedrock upon which his reputation as an engineer literally depended was too great a risk. So he brought these pickmen out, and they lived aboard a boat at the site for 2 months with the capacity to work only at the lowest of tides, which is about 4 hours a day. And you can see this tidal swing in the 2 images in front of you. You can see this on the one hand, the left side for you. This is the open submerged reef exposed at the low tide mark. And on the right hand side, you can see the submerged reef completely covered by this tidal swing. So they're living on this boat for 2 months, working 4 hours a day. But of course, these are land laborers, and so the men are horribly seasick most of the time. Now, I mentioned that at low tide, you can barely see this reef. At high tide, to give you a frame of what that swing is and what these men are experiencing, that's roughly 12 feet underwater. You have about a 12-foot or about 4-meter tidal swing. So Stevenson saw the seasickness and the twice-daily transfer of this moored boat back and forth to the site as hampering productivity. And as such, he constructed a beacon house, which is basically a raised, stilted, quasi-lighthouse without a light on it, on stilts, and it provides accommodation for a limited amount of the work party. In the first year, the site is leveled, the reef is leveled, and then the following year, in 1808, the beacon house is completed, and the first 3 courses of the Aberdeen granite that the lighthouse is constructed from are laid. Now, like the first year, the tide makes construction in 1808 and 1809, the first 2 years of construction, really, really slow. You only get about 80 hours of total work on the bedrock and rock lighthouse each year. However, once you get above that tide in 1810, that's when we see the lighthouse really emerge rapidly. Now, much like leveling the actual site, the work of building the site is harsh. It's long, and it is really, really backbreaking. Stevenson commits his men to 16-hour workdays, 7 days a week for 4 summers, hoisting these Aberdeen granite blocks that weigh up to a ton each by hand, block and tackle. That's all you get. But it is successful. The light is first lit on the 1st of February 1811, and when it's done, the Bell Rock Lighthouse clocks in at roughly 115 feet high and 42 feet in diameter at the base, tapering to roughly 15 feet in diameter at the top. And it is absolutely beautifully crafted. There's double dovetail joints that hold the Bell Rock for over 200 years of storms and waves without any sort of refurbishment or replacement needed. It is an amazing accomplishment for this junior engineer. Stevenson is rightly proud of his engineering marvel, and he seeks to capitalize on its success. He's not content to leave the narrative to others, though, especially if they intend to put John Rennie, his senior partner, to the foreground. So he self-publishes a book hailing it as a great masterpiece. You can see the centerfold bit here showing the accommodation block on the left side, and on the right side you can see that construction, that Bell Rock Lighthouse going up, these 1-ton blocks being hoisted by block and tackle. But this self-published book, which the title is a doozy, it's an account of the Bell Rock Lighthouse, including the details of the erection and peculiar structure of that edifice, to which is prefixed a historical view of the institution and progress of the northern lighthouses. I think he got actually a deal on the word count. But you can see that this self-published book is really a marketing ploy to show that he is an accomplished, independent engineer, and it purposely downplays Rennie's involvement to that end. While Rennie's visitations frustrate Stevenson over the course of the entire project, Stevenson is rather shrewd in trying to ward off these inspection visits from his senior partner. He writes literally scores of letters to Rennie seeking guidance on really, really minute topics in the hopes of annoying Rennie enough that Rennie will just stay away. But Rennie sees his role as a senior partner, and so he dutifully replies to each of these letters, and then Stevenson cheekily ignores Rennie's responses. So there's a bit of not so much animosity, but I would argue, just from a teaching perspective, it's a bit like a doctoral supervisor and a PhD candidate. You know, the younger one wants to supplant the older, more experienced one and see their career take off, and the older one sees it as a duty of care. So a bit of a rift between the two of them in a very professional way. But Rennie does make some serious contributions to the project. We can't discount him just because Stevenson writes him out of the history. It was Rennie who actually recommends the pronounced curvature that we see on this image of the base of the lighthouse, which allows it to shed those forces of the tidal swing and storms. It's also Rennie who insists on the double dovetailing of the granite blocks, both horizontally and vertical, to tie those courses together. And so while Stevenson does deserve a majority of praise for his vision, his engineering capacity, and management, really the project would not have been a structural success without Rennie. Nonetheless, though, Stevenson's PR campaign pays off, and his structure and he as the project manager are hailed as one of the greatest wonders of his age. Fascinatingly, Stevenson's PR campaign and his book about the Bell Rock included a multimedia blitz, which would seem incredibly modern today. For the frontispiece of the book, which you see in front of you, in 1819, Stevenson engaged William Turner, the famous landscape painter, to paint a watercolor of the light providing safe passage in the midst of a storm. Now, Turner never actually visited the Bell Rock. He based his work on drawings provided by Stevenson, as well as his own imagination, but he creates this heroic and expressive landscape that Stevenson was trying to project to the world, that Stevenson can accomplish the unaccomplished, that Stevenson can push the limits of marine engineering and can build lights on places that nobody imagined were structurally possible. And it does work. Stevenson builds 23 lighthouses in his career, surpassing his stepfather and apprentice master by about 10 lights. If you want to see Turner's work, this is actually at the National Galleries of Scotland. While Robert Stevenson was no doubt a marine engineering and architectural genius, he was similarly unafraid to incorporate and improve on existing and emergent technologies. Nowhere else is this more present than in his use of the Fresnel lens. The Fresnel lens is one of those discoveries or technologies that occurs relatively simultaneously, but independently by two scientists, so think Darwin and Spencer, each devising the theory of evolution. Unfortunately for the longer-lived Sir David Brewster, who's on the right side of your screen, his French colleague's publication record and the connections that he has to the international scientific community means that Augustin Jean Fresnel gives his name to the lens instead of us having the Brewster lens. For us, though, it's really important to note that it's Brewster's contributions to science which go beyond the general discovery of the Fresnel lens and extend to his efforts to get the technology employed in lighthouses specifically. So while Fresnel was the first to employ his lens in a lighthouse, where he advocated for a stepped lens lighthouse in 1819, and then he subsequently saw the first one introduced at Cordon Lighthouse in Nouvelle-Aquitaine in France in 1823, Brewster saw the application of the technology to a systemic whole. To quote the 11th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in 1910, famously just before the First World War, when Britain's idea of empire and its place in it changes slightly, you get a really bombastic, wonderful explanation of Brewster's contribution. It says, "It is indisputable that Brewster was earlier in the field than Fresnel, that he described the dioptric apparatus in 1812, that he pressed its adoption on those in authority at least as early as 1820, 2 years before Fresnel suggested it, and that it was finally introduced into British lighthouses mainly by his persistent efforts." So as an aside, for those wondering and really keen on lighthouses, I think this is wonderful. Fresnel's Cordon Lighthouse apparatus was tested on the 20th of August in 1822 in Paris, and they needed a place to install the temporary light to test its function. So it was actually placed on the top of the unfinished Arc de Triomphe. And that successful test was witnessed by the French Commission de Fer, the Commission of Lighthouses, as well as Louis XVIII and his entourage from Mortefontaine, which is a distance about 32 kilometers. So it proved that this idea of the Fresnel lens as a lighthouse beacon worked really, really well. Equally, for those curious about history, if you're wondering why Fresnel died so young when Brewster didn't, it's because Fresnel suffered from TB for most of his life, and he finally succumbed to it at the age of 39, which is why Brewster is the longer-lived and, I wouldn't say more productive, but perhaps governmentally wise, more productive scientist. So how does a Fresnel lens work, and why is it so revolutionary for lighthouse design and function? Well, in order to project a beam of light from a singular light source, a convex lens is used to refract the unorganized light source output into an organized and focused beam. However, the problem arises when a large focused beam is required. To produce the wide focused beam, a very large and a very heavy lens needs to be milled, and this creates four problems. You have to create an imperfection-free glass blank, which can then be milled. Then when you're milling the large blank, you have to do it without damaging a very fragile surface. Then once that's complete, then you have to install and support this large, heavy, delicate lens in a confined area. And then lastly, if that lens were to break, either in installation or during its service life, you have the expense and effort of going and replacing that damaged lens. The Fresnel lens solves these problems through manufacture by segmentation. The lens is made by removing the non-reflective part of the conventional lens, which then leaves a lens with a very, very thin profile. This creates a composite lens which is made up of individual straight prism plates which can be installed in a dedicated housing. And the removal of this excess glass in the supporting brackets that are required for that very large milled lens drastically reduces the weight and physical dimensions, while simultaneously providing a maximum flexibility in beam width, focus, and the flash interval. Moreover, if you go with the Fresnel lens over the single plate, while a single plate might have imperfections in the manufacturing process or be damaged in service life, with a Fresnel lens you can replace those individual prism plates, which allows you far more flexibility both in maintenance but also in general cost to maintain a light. Taking inspiration from the inventiveness of his stepfather Thomas Smith, who installed the first revolving light at Start Point Lighthouse in Sandy, Robert Stevenson didn't just install the Fresnel lens. He saw that its ability to easily incorporate designed flashes and eclipses meant a lighthouse could non-verbally communicate more than just its mere presence. Fresnel lenses come in three major varieties. They come in fixed, they come in flashing, and they come in what are called occulting lights. So fixed lights are the constant beam on a fixed heading, which are especially useful for providing accurate directional information on approaches to harbors, estuaries, ports, etc. This is sort of what we see, obviously in a 360-degree capability, but this is sort of what we see at the Dover Pharos that we saw in the very early part, that Roman light, as well as later coastal beacons. Flashing lights are rotating lenses which give the characteristic flash that we associate with that typical lighthouse look. And the particular pattern of flashings is what we call the character of a light. The interval of repetition is known as the period of the light. Occulting lights are a bit of a combination of the two, and these are lights that are normally on and then momentarily extinguished before coming back on again. Short eclipses interrupted by long periods of light. So as each Fresnel lens, called a flash panel, passes in front of the central light source, which is aligned in turn with the center of the Fresnel lens to ensure there's even illumination, the whole flash panel lights up as one even beam of light. And it's this organized light from the flash panel, which are naturally called flashes, which are the beam that we see from afar. Now, the flash is actually an illusion created by the rotating nature of the lens frame. The brass flame and the blank panels that interrupt those lensed flash panels, these are called eclipses, and they create a dark zone for the light's rotation. And the configuration of the lens panels and the eclipse panels, as well as the speed of rotation, is what creates the light's signature beacon. The rotating lamps were operated by clockwork mechanisms, and they're illuminated by oil, which later becomes methylated spirits and paraffin all the way through to the 20th century when they become electrified. The clockwork mechanism is driven by a descending weight, and it gives about 30 minutes of rotation. Think of it as a giant grandfather clock. But this means that every 30 minutes the lamp mechanism has to be manually rewound by the light keeper. Likewise, the illumination oil or the spirits, these only last about 20 minutes before they have to be refilled. And then still, of course, this doesn't exhaust the lightkeeper's duties because they're meant to take weather readings as well, and these have to be done every 3 hours. So a lightkeeper's watch is 4 hours in length, and for remote lights, this can last 2 to 4 weeks, depending upon whether or not they can be relieved. If there's obviously heavy seas, then you have to wait to be relieved by somebody from land. But you're constantly working, you're constantly rewinding the light, refilling the paraffin methylated spirits reservoirs, and then your kind of respite is perhaps to look outside and take the weather readings. But it's constant running of stairs. It's a very strenuous activity to maintain these Fresnel lenses. Robert Stevenson goes on to have 3 sons, Alan, David, and Thomas Stevenson, and it's each of these 3 sons who join the family business either by choice or by coercion. Robert Stevenson, the eldest, I call him the heir apparent. He's a driven man very much like his father. But from the age of 13, all of the sons begin their apprenticeships with their father. Each summer, the 3 boys, they go and they sail with their father/apprentice master aboard the Commission of Lighthouses ship, the Pharos, on his inspection of the lights. Now, as an aside, the Northern Lighthouse Board, the inheritor of the Commission of Lighthouses, they still maintain this tradition of the inspection ship being called Pharos for Lighthouse, and they're actually on their 10th inspection ship called Pharos. So Stevenson would very much recognize the inspection vessel, even though it's much more modern than his today, at least recognize the name. So while the boys did receive a classical university education, there's actually no option other than becoming an engineer like their father. The choice really was engineering or engineering. So by 1827, at the age of 20, Alan Stevenson has completed his apprenticeship and he joins his father full-time as a junior engineer, very much like Robert did with his father, Thomas Smith. Now, as I say, Alan was strong-willed and driven like his father, and Alan really wants to become the professional heir to his father in more ways than one. He would go on to build 10 less lighthouses than his father. He would build 13 lighthouses like his grandfather, but he would work to eclipse his father's engineering marvel at the Bell Rock. That was his core goal. So how does one surpass the greatest marine engineer of his age and perhaps the greatest marine engineering project of its age? Well, Allen's greatest engineering achievement was the construction of Skerryvore Lighthouse, considered to be the most graceful and beautiful of all lighthouses to present, and you can see an image of Skerryvore in front of you. It looks a lot like the Bell Rock light, largely because Allen is, of course, apprenticed to his father who built the Bell Rock, but also because Skerryvore is a deep-sea light just like the Bell Rock. However, here is where the similarities stop. While the Bell Rock is 11 miles off the coast of Arbroath, Skerryvore is 14 miles off the coast of Tiree. Arbroath and the Bell Rock are relatively protected by the mainland of Scotland, but Tiree and Skerryvore face the full fetch and fury of the Atlantic Ocean. Likewise, the Bell Rock marks a hazardous, relatively small, tidally exposed reef, but Skerryvore has a reef that stretches roughly 10 miles and is largely underwater. Indeed, Sir Walter Scott, the famous novelist, actually writes during a visit to Skerryvore with Robert Stevenson on one of his inspection tours in 1814 that, quote, "The rock was carefully measured by Mr. S., Mr. Stevenson. It will be a most desolate position for a lighthouse. The Bell Rock and Eddystone make a joke of it. For the nearest land is the wild island of Tiree at 14 miles distance. So much for the Skerryvore." So when Robert and Allen arrive in Tiree in 1834 to survey Skerryvore, Allen notes that the one side of the island of Tiree had higher rents because they benefited from shore-washed timbers and goods from wrecked ships. This is the wrecking that we talked about previously with the Bell Rock and the Inchcape Bell. So in 1837, at the age of 30, Allen is given engineering oversight for most of the works at Skerryvore by his father. And like his father at the Bell Rock, Allen establishes a station house at Hynish in Tiree in preparation for offshore work the following summer. He then spends the late summer of 1838 building a stilted barracks on Skerryvore in preparation for the following summer's construction start, very much mimicking his father's work at the Bell Rock with that stilted barracks house. But in November of 1838, less than 2 months after constructing that stilted barracks house on the rock, a storm completely wipes out that construction. Work then recontinues in the summer of 1839 after they build a new barracks of the same design, but beefed up to, quite honestly, unimaginable proportions, kind of a barracks house on steroids. And this barracks tower now has a height of 60 feet, some 18 meters above sea level, and can house 30 to 40 men compared to the Bell Rock's roughly 15. So it is a much larger, much more robust, much more adventurous undertaking, the Skerryvore Light. Similar considerations are made for the lighthouse itself. Some 4,300 granite blocks weighing between 0.8 to 2.5 tons are quarried, cut, and finished before being shipped out to the building site at an incredible pace. And I say incredible because on average, up to 95 blocks of granite are being delivered to the site each day. Total construction takes about 4 years, with the last block being raised in July of 1842, and then incredibly, though enduring immense physical and natural trials, including violent storms of 1839 to 1840, no one actually dies, which I always find incredible. 95 granite blocks weighing somewhere between 1 to 2.5 tons being lifted by hand, and there's no loss of life. It's an amazing feat of occupational safety, even today. The finished tower is about 156 feet high. The walls at the base are about 9.5 feet thick and about 2 feet thick at the top. And unlike his father's Bell Rock, Allen's Skerryvore has no elaborate dovetailing. If you remember, Rennie requires this vertical and horizontal dovetailing. Allen theorizes that the sheer weight of his granite blocks is going to compress the tower into a single immovable mass of rock, and he's absolutely right. He continues his achievement and his place as the heir apparent of the family dynasty. In 1843 to 1853, he actually serves as engineer-in-chief of the Northern Lighthouse Board, a capacity his father actually served in from 1798 to 1842, so he inherits it directly from his father. And he succeeds, as his father did, in really setting a pace for cutting-edge engineering triumph, not just in Scotland and not just in the family, but we'll see that he and his brothers really set the stage for an internationalization of the Stevenson trade of marine engineering and a marine lighthouse building. Now, I mentioned that Allen is the oldest son. The middle son, David, he's born just about 8 years after his older brother, and I call him the innovator because while his younger years very much echo that of his older brother, he joined the family business at the age of 23, he goes on to build 28 lights, as well as one more in collaboration with his younger brother Thomas, and this surpasses both his grandfather, father, and older brother Allen in quantity constructed. So in that capacity alone, he'd be an innovator of being able to churn out lights. But Where his brother continued the tradition set by their father of monumental constructions in difficult locations using the massive weight of materials to conquer the elements, David is a more cerebral, scientific, inventive mind, and he pioneers untried and atypical materials to conquer the wind and waves, and he would continue his father and grandfather's legacy of mobilizing emergent technology. His father brought to the Fresnel lens, his grandfather, that novel kind of disco ball reflector collector that was cherry-picked from Edinburgh's streetlights. So, for example, David pioneers the transition of coal and oil illumination lamps in lighthouses to methylated spirits and paraffin oil, which is used all the way to the mid-20th century when the lights are electrified. He takes up the role of engineer-in-chief of the Northern Lighthouses Board from his older brother, Alan, and he serves from 1853 to 1855, and then is senior engineer to the Northern Lighthouse Board from 1855 to 1881. So I said that David was a cerebral, inventive mind, and Muckleflugga is his Skerryvore, or his Bell Rock. Muckleflugga is Britain's most northerly isle, and its light is built out of imperial necessity. In 1853, Britain is heavily engaged in the Crimean War, and the Royal Navy is blockading the Russian Empire's Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel. So in order to assist the Royal Navy's navigation out of the Shetlands and Scapa Flow, the Admiralty requires a light to be installed on Muckleflugga. It is going to be difficult, though. The angled sheer sides of Muckleflugga make it extremely difficult to land and to climb. As such, all the material for the lighthouse needs to be wenched by rope or carried literally on the workers' backs up this precarious, hazardous rock escarpment. David, though, does take lighthouse engineering and innovation to new heights at Muckleflugga. Like the older Stevenson structures built by his father and grandfather, he carves access steps out of the living rock, and you can see those access steps in the picture, as well as still walk them to this day when you can land. And like his brother, he also sinks massive iron foundation beams deep into the rock. He drives them 10 feet down. However, he recognizes the difficulty of transporting large stones up this steep, glassy, windswept, water-swept surface. And so David pioneers, and he builds the structure out of brick. And actually, Muckleflugga is the first brick lighthouse ever built, and it really shows a way forward for many lights worldwide all the way through to the present. So while Muckleflugga is David's Bell Rock or Skerryvore, my personal favorite of his lights, not because of its graceful classic Stevenson style, is Chicken Rock Lighthouse on Chicken Rock on the Isle of Man. No particular reason, I just really like the idea that there's a place in the UK called Chicken Rock. Robert's youngest son, Thomas, was more traditionally intellectual than both of his brothers. Most of the 31 lights Thomas assisted in designing were the result of collaborative efforts between he and his brothers as part of the larger Stevenson family company. In fact, Thomas never actually wanted to be an engineer. It's why I call him the reluctant engineer. His intellectual curiosity favored more purely academic careers. He rather fancied being a writer or a publisher or a bookseller. In fact, at one point in his young life, he was found by his father, Robert, to have bits of paper in his pocket with parts of Thomas's prose scribbled on them. And his father was absolutely horrified and infuriated, telling Thomas, quote, "Give up such nonsense and mind your business," meaning engineering. Thoroughly chastised by a very practical father, he was actually sent to be trained in a gentleman's career, that is to say, engineering, that classic Robert Stevenson choice of engineer or engineer. But he's not without his abilities as an engineer. His intellectual capacity really serves him well when he oversaw the installation of the light of his brother's masterpiece at Skerryvore, as well as other kind of attached necessary innovations that assist in creating the modern lighthouse. Though part of the family lighthouse business, Thomas's overarching contributions were to the more functional, practical applications of meteorological science and technology to marine navigation safety. Among his most notable achievements was the first trialing of an electric lighthouse lamp in 1869, but he's probably best known for his meteorological analyses, including the first discussion of wave height as a square root function of fetch, and the development of the Stevenson screen in 1864, which you can see in front of you. He was thoroughly fascinated by winds and wave. Even while assisting Alan at Skerryvore on Tiree, he spent literally hours on the beach noting wave frequencies and deflections. I'm sure he was an absolute joy to talk to at parties. The Stevenson screen, though, is now an industry-standard instrument shelter, which encloses meteorological instruments against precipitation and direct heat sources, while still allowing free air circulation around the instrument. And so it's become a cornerstone piece of a much larger scientific community than just lighthouses. And the image you see in front of you, this is his original discussion in academic press of the screen. I love it because it's just that page. There's no long-winded academic prose. There's no 15 pages of citations. It is, here's a screen. It works marvelously. And on the right-hand side, you can actually see the Radcliffe Meteorological Station at Oxford University. This was in August of 2018. But Radcliffe is the oldest Met station in the world, with records going back 250 plus years. And the Stevenson screen was first installed in the station in 1880. So his contributions go far beyond, his innovative contributions go far beyond just the physical structures of lighthouses. This reluctant engineer really stakes a claim to the wide science of meteorological observation intersecting with marine navigation safety. Two brothers, David Allen and Charles Stevenson, continue the family business into a fourth generation. They're the only sons of David Stevenson. He has a third child, Jane, but she, as a lady of the period, doesn't continue into the family business. Alan and Thomas Stevenson, they each have one son who in both cases goes into the arts, which is a bit ironic considering Robert Stevenson's response of horror at his son wanting to be a writer. But by the time the two brothers take over the family business, much of the major lights in Scotland and the Isle of Man have been built by their predecessors. However, David Allen and Charles really don't want to rest on the family's business laurels, and they would go on to build another 26 lighthouses together across the United Kingdom. Now, like their forebears, David Allen and Charles lights, they become celebrated masterpieces of the craft. And like Robert Stevenson, they become known for their contemporary ingenuity and their connection to the natural history and their inspiration for the arts. Charles's son, also a David Allen, just to make things quite confusing, would be the last of the Stevensons to work as a lighthouse engineer. The image in front of you will be quite familiar to many of the ornithologists in the audience. This is Bass Rock, and it's perhaps one of the most famous ornithological sites in the world, certainly within the UK. And this ornithological spectacle really intersects with a very long archaeological and historical biography, which we don't have time to go into in detail, but to give you a brief overview, because it does intersect with the lighthouse history. Bass Rock, the physical island, as I say, has a very colorful history. It served originally as a monastic chapel site for the early medieval hermit St. Baldred in the 8th century, and then later there's a castle site for the noble family, the Lauders of the Bass, from the 11th century until the 1650s when Cromwell invades, and then that serves as a jail from 1671 to 1701 when it's abandoned finally by the government. The current owners, the Dalrymple family, they acquire the Bass Rock in 1706 for a nominal amount and have actually owned it ever since. The Bass Rock Lighthouse was designed by David Allen Stevenson, and it was under consideration and construction roughly 1897 to 1902. David Allen, ever the businessman and engineer, he made use of the existing quarried stone that was there from the castle to construct much of the lighthouse structure. And rather unfortunately for us today, this means he demolished the 13th century Lauder Keep as well as the 17th and 18th century Governor's House, in addition to other undescribed associated structures. So we've kind of gained a historic structure at an incredible loss of much older structures. But today, the Bass Rock is most noted for its internationally famous colony of northern gannets, the largest colony of northern gannets in the world. Indeed, the actual scientific name of the northern gannet, Morus bassinus, is derived from the Bass Rock itself. So you can see this intertwining of natural history with archaeological and historical and now lighthouse history. I suspect most people will go see it for the gannets rather than the lighthouse, but if you do happen to go there for the gannets, make sure to see David Allen's masterpiece, Lighthouse on Bass Rock. I said at the start that the Stevenson family history consistently intersects with the artistic realm and the lore of the British coastal light, and that's certainly true of David Allen and Charles's career as well. David Allen's career was certainly productive, but there's really one light in particular that links he and his family's engineering capacity with the arts, and that of course is the Flannan Isle light. The Flannan Isle light reflects the expanding engineering business ventures of the Stevenson family at this point, and it was designed by David Allen and it was constructed between 1895 and 1899. It's about 23 meters high, and it's pretty typical of a turn-of-the-century lighthouse, which means it's generally unremarkable. There's a lot of them. But it's the events that lead up to the 15th of December 1900, exactly 1 year after the lighthouse is first lit, that really seal its place in historical lore. On the 15th of December 1900, the steamship Arctur is completing passage from Philadelphia to Leith, and on passing the Flannan Isles, the Arctur notes the lighthouse is unlit and that the weather is extremely poor. Now, the light's unlit state is passed on to the Northern Lighthouse Board when the Arctur reaches Leith on the 18th of December, and the relief vessel, the lighthouse tender Hesperus, is sent to reach the light and find out what's going on. And it reaches the light at noon on the 26th of December due to this continued bad weather that was first reported by the Arctur. The mystery of the Flannan Light, manned by a disappeared James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, is recounted in verse by the Georgian poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson. Gibson's born in Hexham, Northumberland, and he begins publishing his poetry in 1895 with the first book of poems published in 1902. Much of his early works, including the Flannan Isle, they focus on the macabre, which is very similar to the school of thought at that point for British poetry, and it's supplanted later by First World War and post-war poetry. So what is the dreadful accident of the Flannans? Well, as I say, Gibson gives us the best narrative, albeit artistically licensed, account of the incident in his 1912 poem, Flannan Isle. Though 3 men dwell on Flannan Isle to keep the lamp alight, as we steered on the less we caught no glimmer through the night. A passing ship at dawn had brought the news, and quickly we set sail, to find out what strange thing might ail the keepers of the deep-sea light. The winter day broke blue and bright, with glancing sun and glancing spray, as o'er the swell our boat made way, as gallant as a gull in flight. But as we neared the lonely isle, and looked up at the naked height, and saw the lighthouse towering white, with blinded lantern that all night had never shot a spark of comfort through the dark, so ghostly in the cold sunlight, it seemed that we were struck the while with wonder all too dreads for words. And as into the tiny creek we stole beneath the hanging crag, we saw 3 queer, black, ugly birds, too big by far, in my belief, for guillemot or shag, like seamen sitting bolt upright upon a half-tide reef. But as we neared, they plunged from sight without a sound or spurt of white. And still too mazed to speak, we landed and made fast the boat, and climbed the track in single file, each wishing he was safe afloat, on any sea, however far, so be it far from Flannan Isle. And still we seemed to climb and climb, as though we'd lost all count of time, and so must climb forevermore. Yet all too soon we reached the door, the black sun-blistered lighthouse door that gaped for us ajar. As on the threshold for a spell we paused, we seemed to breathe the smell of lime-wash and of tar, familiar as our daily breath, as though 'twere some strange scent of death. And so, yet wondering side by side, we stood a moment, still tongue-tied, and each with black foreboding eyed the door ere we should fling it wide, to leave the sunlight for the gloom, till plucking courage up at last, hard on each other's heels we passed into the living room. Yet as we crowded through the door, we only saw a table spread for dinner, meat and cheese and bread, but all untouched and no one there, as though when they sat down to eat, ere they could even taste, alarm had come, and they in haste had risen and left the bread and meat, for at the table head a chair lay tumbled on the floor. We listened, but we only heard the feeble cheeping of a bird that starved upon its perch, and listening still without a word, we set about our hopeless search. We hunted high, we hunted low, and soon ransacked the empty house. Then o'er the island to and fro we ranged to listen and to look in every cranny, cleft, and nook that might have his a bird or mouse. But though we searched from shore to shore, we found no sign in any place, and soon again stood face to face before the gaping door, and stole into the room once more as frightened children steal. Aye, though we hunted high and low, and hunted everywhere, of the 3 men's fate we found no trace, of any kind in any place, but a door ajar, and an untouched meal, and an over-toppled chair. And as we listened in the gloom of that forsaken living room, a chill clutch on our breath, we, though how ill chance came to all who kept the Flannan Light, and how the rock had been the death of many a likely lad. 6 had come to a sudden end, and 3 had gone stark mad, and one whom we'd all known as friend had leapt from the lantern one still night, and had fallen dead by the lighthouse wall, and long we thought on the 3 we sought, and of what might yet befall. Like curs a glance has brought to heel, we listened flinching there, and looked on the untouched meal and the overtoppled chair. We seemed to stand for an endless while, though still no word was said, 3 men alive on Flannan Isle, who thought on 3 men dead. Like their ancestors, David, Allen, and Charles didn't just continue the family business as is, they would innovate in new ways, most notably in the trade of intellectual property. That's why I call them the exporters. The turn of the century was a really fruitful time, though, for the British Empire, and the Stevensons' reputation and engineering accomplishment and relatively standardized technologies, which they had honed over generations in Scotland, were ready for export to the rest of the world. Indeed, international envoys saw the Stevenson family's ability to construct safe navigation networks, and they actively recruited engineers from the firm to create national lighthouse boards elsewhere. The first of these exchanges was in 1868, when the Stevensons were hired by the Tokugawa shogunate to chart Japan's coastal waters and build lighthouses at appropriate locations to aid in British shipping. Richard Henry Brunton, an engineer with the company, was dispatched to oversee this construction project, and over the course of the next 7.5 years, which would span the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration period, Brunton oversaw construction of 26 lighthouses, 2 light vessels, a creation of the Japanese lighthouse keeper system, which was modeled on originally Thomas Smith and Robert Stevenson's regulations and the Northern Lighthouse Board, as well as founding Japan's first school of civil engineering. For his efforts, Brunton was personally recognized by Emperor Meiji in 1871 and awarded a prize in 1876, and to this day he's still referred to as the father of Japanese lighthouses. I think we see this transition best, though, in the architecture of the period, and those 3 images of lighthouses you see in front of you really bear this out. On your left, you see a Tokugawa pre-Meiji lighthouse. This is the Sumiyoshi Takadora Lighthouse, which is located in Osaka. In the middle, you'll see an early Meiji lighthouse, which shows that mixture of a European top, the lantern, with a Tokugawa faired base, like we see with the Sumiyoshi Takadora light on the left. This middle lighthouse is from Kudan. It's located in Tokyo's Kudenkita district. And then on the far right, we see Brunton's Omazaki Lighthouse, which was built 1872 to 1874. And you can see that it is basically just a transplant, lock, stock, and barrel of the Stevenson developed lighthouse design. If you see this lantern design pretty much anywhere in the world, you can be guaranteed that the Stevenson had a part in it in some capacity. The export of intellectual property developed by the Stevensons to Japan is not a one-off. A similar scenario plays out throughout the world. You can see a Stevenson light, for instance, in Papeete and Tahiti. Likewise, we see them in Chile. In fact, Chile is probably the best example of this export of intellectual property in the 19th and early 20th century. The reason for this is that the mid to late 19th century is a golden age for commercial navigation through the Straits of Magellan. There's no Panama Canal yet, so movement to the Pacific colonial possessions has to be made by the tip of South America. And indeed, by 1867, the Pacific Steam Navigation Company has created a regular service from Liverpool to Valparaiso with a stopover in Punta Arenas. So the importance of the Strait of Magellan and the increased shipping load that goes through it isn't lost on the Chilean government. Indeed, they see a similar problem of loss of shipping that we saw very early on in the Stevenson dynasty. Between 1869 and 1894, 30 ships are lost within Chilean navigatable waters. And as such, President Jorge Montt, he tasked the Chilean ambassador to London, Augustine Ross, to find a company and a person suitable to create a series of lighthouses and navigation beacons for the shipping lanes along these critical sea arteries that Chile is developing. In 1893, Ambassador Ross finds his man in George Henry Slight, who you see in front of you here. Slight, who's from 1859 to 1934, he comes from a family of engineers. His father had worked on inventing revolving light mechanisms and had worked for the Stevenson Company for some time. And Slight himself was an apprenticed mechanical engineer. He'd worked on steamers in India for some time before taking up a position with the Stevenson Company, and then later working at Trinity House, which is the English and Welsh version of the Scottish and Northern Lighthouses Board developed by the Stevensons. So Slight would be very comfortable and very familiar with lighthouse engineering from a very young age. Indeed, his grandfather, granduncle, and father were all employed by the Stevensons as workers and engineers stretching back to the Bell Rock and Robert Stephenson, the very foundation of this engineering dynasty. So in 1893, Ambassador Ross approaches Slight about constructing Chile's first modern lighthouses, and Slight sees an opportunity here. His first task is to construct lights on the Evangelista Islets, which are 4 small rocky islands located about 30 kilometers west of the Strait of Magellan. You see the islands in front of you on the left part of your screen. Indeed, these islands mark the western entrance to the strait itself, and like Bell Rock, Skerryvore, Muckleflugga, and Duartak that were created by his apprentice masters, Robert, Allen, David, and Thomas Stevenson, the Evangelista Islets are open to the full fetch of the ocean. When Slight first sees the islets on the 2nd of May of 1884, he remarks in his diary, quote, "I never imagined seeing something so wild and desolate as those emerging dark rocks in the middle of the raging waves. To see these stormy craggy rocks was frightening. With a dim light on the horizon, we could see large waves crashing heavily in the western part of the islands, a vision that hardly anyone can imagine." So I think what Sleight sees here is he sees very much a similar condition to Bell Rock, to Scary Vore, to this extremely open stretch of ocean, to the full fury of the sea and weather, and he sees an opportunity to really imprint his own legacy as an independent engineer on the lighthouse world. The image that you see in front of you of the Evangelista Islets, this was actually a photo taken by Sleight in 1893, and the arrow that I put in there points to where the Faro Evangelista would eventually be built. Work on the lighthouse began on the 30th of April 1895, and the highly refined design system developed by the Stevenson Company saw the lighthouse completed in just under 2 years, an incredible feat. The light is first lit on the 18th of September 1896, Chilean Independence Day. However, while the Faro Evangelistas was Sleight's masterpiece, Sleight was not done, much like the Stevenson family itself. Faro Evangelista is a brick and iron beam lighthouse like Mokelflugge. In fact, all of Sleight's lighthouses would be brick and iron except the Felix Bay lighthouse, which is built from granite, and it had been started and had some substantial problems before Sleight took over. And he eventually delivered an excellent structure on it, but that's kind of an outlier because he didn't start it. He was just working from somebody else's design. But by the time Sleight finished his contracts with the Chilean government in 1918, he'd built 72 lighthouses and fixed beacons, nearly triple that built by each Stevenson in their individual careers. And like Brunton, Sleight would establish the National Light Service as well, the Chilean Maritime Signaling Service, as well as continue to be an advisor to the Chilean Maritime Signaling Service and the Chilean government in retirement. Sleight eventually settled in Valparaiso for the remainder of his life. He married Charlotte Lee, with whom he had 2 sons, George Marshall Sleight and James Bunster Sleight. His memory in the Chilean national kind of story remains as strong as ever, though. The National Lighthouse Museum in Valparaiso, which you can visit if you're in that part of the world with Zegram, is called the George Sleight Lighthouse Museum, and there are numerous geographical features, as well as the Chilean lighthouse rescue vessel and salvage ship, which is the Ingenierio George Sleight Marshall, the BTS-63. They name it for him, very similar to the recurrent naming of the Northern Lighthouse Board tender. Sleight passes away in 1934, and he's buried in the Cementerio General in Valparaiso. But the epitaph on his grave really reflects the incredible amount of work he completed in only 22 years. It says, quote, "His lights still shine over the waters of the Pacific Ocean." And I think that really speaks to this kind of crescendo of lighthouse construction worldwide that the Stevensons started with Robert Stevenson and Thomas Smith, that were reaching an apex of marking these extremely hazardous navigatable stretches of water. And we're seeing this what was once confined to the UK waters, once confined to Scotland, really branching out to a worldwide dynastic legacy of the Stevenson family and their engineering vision. Funnily, while the Stevensons have a continued impact in the world of science and engineering, their greatest contribution to modern culture was not actually in the family's traditional domain. Indeed, this branch of the accomplished family tree actually comes from Thomas Stevenson, who's the hopeful writer turned sort of reluctant engineer, the one whose father, Robert, chastised him for having prose in his pocket. The image in front of you is Thomas Stevenson with his only child, a son, at Callander in 1866. Any guesses on who is Thomas Stevenson's son? I'll give you a moment to think on it. And no, for those wondering, the image strikes me, it's not the vampirically immortal Daniel Day-Lewis, though I think he would make a great candidate to play the role of this individual. In a grand twist of irony, Thomas Stevenson's only child is the novelist Robert Louis Stevenson. Born in 1850, Robert Louis Stevenson had no intention of being an engineer like his forebears. He suffered from chronic respiratory illness, which he inherited from his mother's side, and this was exacerbated by damp and cold, which really isn't ideal for a lighthouse engineer. But his sickly upbringing was filled with stories read by his nanny, Cummy, trips to building sites with his father, and summer explorations outside Edinburgh, which would fuel his imagination. Unlike his own father, Thomas was actually supportive of Robert Louis Stevenson's early writing career, and he even paid for the printing of his first publication in 1866, when Robert Louis Stevenson was 16. This work, The Pentland Rising, A Page of History, 1666, is an account of the Covenanters' rebellion from tales that his nanny would tell him when he was younger, and it was published on the occasion of the rebellion's 200th anniversary. Robert Louis Stevenson told his father in April of 1871 that he would not become an engineer, but rather would become a writer. The decision not to follow his father in the family business was hugely disappointing for Thomas, but his mother does note in her diary that Thomas was, quote, wonderfully resigned to his son's chosen career, And yes, he did require Robert Louis Stevenson to study law and be called to the Scottish bar just in case he'd failed as a writer and he would have a fallback position. I suppose parents will be parents. It sounds like kids and parents discussing what to major in college. Nonetheless, while he was not an engineer, Robert Louis Stevenson's travels with his fathers and the connection to the family business didn't mean lighthouses left his life entirely. The island of Arid, for instance, on the Ross of Mull, was the construction site and the shore station for Thomas Stevenson's lighthouse masterpiece, the 11-meter Du Artac light, which was built 1867 to 1871. The many trips to Arid with his father during his early university illness spells, as well as some later wanderings to take a page out of Churchill, informed Robert Louis Stevenson's setting for David Balfour's shipwrecking in Kidnapped. While he was an accomplished writer for sure, Robert Louis Stevenson never really got over the disappointment he caused his father and that of the family business by not becoming an engineer. Indeed, of March in 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson writes to his editor at Scribner's, correcting a biographical piece from the Book Buyer magazine. He says, quote, "My father is not an inspector of lighthouses. He, two of my uncles, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather in succession have been engineers in the Scotch Lighthouse Service. All the sea lights in Scotland are signed with our name, and my father's services to lighthouse optics have been distinguished indeed. I might write books till 1900 and not serve humanity so well." In a January 1894 letter to the American painter and muralist Will Lowe, a friend of Robert Louis Stevenson's, Robert Louis Stevenson continues this theme of artistic freedom versus the social contribution that he's struggling with by lamenting, quote, "I think of the Renaissance fellows and their all-round human sufficiency and compare it with the ineffable smallness of the field in which we labor and in which we do so little. I think David Balfour a nice little book, and very artistic, and just the thing to occupy the leisure of a busy man, but for the top flower of man's life it seems to me inadequate. Small is the word. It is a small age, and I am of it. I could have wished to be otherwise busy in this world. I ought to have been able to build lighthouses, and write David Balfours too." So perhaps we have the benefit of hindsight in Robert Louis Stevenson's contributions, but he never forgot that his ancestors saved lives, while as he saw it, he wrote children's books. Perhaps this duality is most evident in the continued imagery of lighthouses in his novels and poems. I think the internal struggle that Robert Louis Stevenson seemed to have for most of his life between the history of his family as lighthouse engineers versus his own work as a teller of stories is best borne out by his consistent theme of lighthouses and light keepers in both his poetic and narrative works. One of the best examples is his 1870 work, The Light Keeper. "The brilliant kernel of the night, the flaming light room circles me. I sit within a blaze of light, held high above the dusky sea. Far off the surf doth break and roar along bleak miles of moonlit shore, where through the tides the tumbling wave falls in an avalanche of foam and drives its churned waters home up many an undercliff and cave. The clear bell chimes, the clockwork strain, the turning lenses flash and pass, frame turning within glittering frame with frosty gleam of moving glass. Unseen by me each dusky hour, the sea waves welter up the tower, or in the ebb subside again, and ever and anon all night, drawn from afar by charm of light, a seabird beats against the pane. And lastly, wind dawn ends the night, and belts the semi-orb of sea, the tall pale Pharos in the light, looks white and spectral as may be. The early ebb is out, the green straight belt of seaweed now is seen, that round the basement of the tower marks out the inner space of tide, and watching men are heavy-eyed, and sleepless lips are dry and sour. The night is over like a dream, the seabirds cry and dip themselves, and in the early sunlight steam, the newly bared and dripping shells. Around those verge the glassy wave, with lisping wash is heard to lave. While on the white tower lifted high, with yellow light in faded glass, the circling lenses flash and pass, and sickly shine against the sky. As the steady lenses circle with a frosty gleam of glass, and the clear bell chimes, and the oil brims over the lip of the burner, quiet and still at his dusk the lonely lightkeeper holds his vigil. Lured from afar, the bewildered seagull beats dully against the lantern. Yet he stirs not, lifts not his head from the desk where he reads, lifts not his eyes to see the chill-blind circle of night, watching him through the panes. This is his country's guardian, the outmost century of peace. This is the man who gives up all that is lovely in living for the means to live. Poetry cunningly gilds the life of the lightkeeper, held on high in the blackness in the burning kernel of night. The seaman sees and blesses him. The poet, deep in a sonnet, remembers his inky fingers, fitly to praise him. Only we behold him, sitting, patient and stolid, martyr to a salary. So this ends our exploration of Lighthouse Stevensons, and as I promised at the start, we've returned back to the headquarters building of the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh. It's from here that the Stevensons, as a familial dynasty, really created, nurtured, invented, and pushed the modern lighthouse into the modern world. When we get a chance to rejoin ships and explore the world once again, be on the lookout for Stevenson's lighthouses, those graceful curves that we saw at Bell Rock and Skerryvore, those lantern houses that we saw at Muckleflugga, Du Artak, and Bass Rock. These are the things that mark out a Stevenson light and mark out the engineering triumph that they developed. If you'd like to learn more about the Lighthouse Stevensons as a family and their interaction with wider society during the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, I highly recommend The Lighthouse Stevensons by Bella Bathurst. It's a wonderful narrative that she's constructed that interweaves things that we've looked at, both the engineering triumphs as well as the literary triumphs. You can find that on Amazon or any other major bookseller.